She ran the company from behind a desk no one saw, and he, the man she quietly helped succeed, never even knew her name. What would you do if the person you worked for every day treated you like you didn't exist? If your brilliance, your kindness, your late nights and sacrifices were invisible? Clara Hayes was once a teacher, a writer, a woman in love, but life has a way of stripping us down until all that's left is duty. She spent her days quietly holding together a company she didn't own, while caring for a mother who no longer remembered her face. And every morning, the man in the corner office walked past her, without a glance. Until one evening changed everything. One moment where silence broke, and the woman he never saw became unforgettable. This is a story of becoming, of what happens when a woman chooses not to disappear. So, if you've ever felt unseen, if you've ever wondered when it'll be your turn to be heard, stay with us. You won't forget Clara Hayes. And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, or leave us a comment. Your voice matters here. Now, let's go back to the very beginning. She was the kind of woman people walked past every day, even the man whose entire empire she helped keep running. Every morning, Clara Hayes arrived at Hawthorne and Wells 10 minutes before the office lights flickered on. It was a habit formed out of necessity, once now it felt like a rhythm etched into her bones. The sidewalks of Charleston still held the chill of dawn, and the wrought iron balconies above her seemed to lean forward, listening to the hush of the early hour. She walked briskly, coffee thermos in one hand, worn canvas tote in the other. Her dark brown hair was pinned in a low bun, the kind that didn't attract attention. Her skirt was plain, her blouse tucked carefully, neat, modest, invisible by design. Clara was 32, though most days she felt older. Grief had a way of aging a woman, even if quietly. It dulled the shine of lipstick, softened the lines of ambition, taught you how to fade into the corners of a room with grace. At Hawthorne and Wells, Clara worked as the executive secretary on the 6th floor, though no one ever said it with that many syllables. Around the office, she was Ben's assistant, or just the front desk, and Benjamin Hawthorne. He was the reason people spoke in hushed tones when the elevator chimed. 42 years old, founder, CEO, polished, punctual, and unbothered. He wore tailored suits like second skin, and his silver cufflinks caught the light the way his gaze often didn't. He was all sharp edges and cool efficiency. He remembered numbers, not birthdays. He returned investor calls before replying to his own brother. And Clara. To him, Clara was necessary, efficient, unremarkable. He never noticed how she arranged his schedule to avoid his least favorite lunch spots, or how she remembered the exact temperature he liked his conference room set to before board meetings, or how she quietly corrected his grammar in press releases, never asking for credit. But Clara didn't need credit. She needed security, stability, a reason to get up each day and keep going. After her father passed, and her marriage dissolved in silence rather than rage, Clara had learned how to survive by staying small. She had a mother with early-onset Alzheimer's, a mortgage she could barely cover, and a future she didn't dare plan for anymore. So she woke up, dressed plainly, worked diligently, and spoke softly. Until that Tuesday morning. Benjamin had just returned from a development conference in Dallas. He swept through the glass doors with the energy of someone who'd already finished 2 espressos and a round of mental chess. Clara stood to greet him as always, file folder in hand. "You're weak at a glance, Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her voice even. He didn't take the folder. Instead, his eyes scanned her briefly. Then he spoke. "Clara," He said, "If you intend to represent this company, you might consider dressing like you belong to it." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't cruel. But it landed with the weight of something carefully sharpened. For a moment, the room went still just long enough for the hum of the office printer to sound like a siren. Clara froze. Her cheeks flushed with heat. But her expression didn't change. She simply nodded, placed the file on his desk, and turned away. No one else seemed to notice. No one ever did. She returned to her own desk and sat down slowly, folding her hands in her lap. The sting of his words pressed against her ribs, but deeper still was the quiet humiliation, the kind that doesn't bruise skin, but sinks beneath it. Outside, the sun had begun to climb past the rooftops. Spanish moss swayed gently along the street below, and horse-drawn carriages creaked through the historic district like whispers from another time. Clara stared at her reflection in the darkened window glass. Same cardigan, same quiet posture, same woman. But this time, something flickered behind her eyes. A pause, a question. Why did I let that hurt so much? She wasn't angry. Not quite. But she felt startled, as if someone had spoken out loud a thought she hadn't yet dared admit, that she had become invisible, even to herself. The rest of the day moved on with numbing routine. Clara responded to vendor emails, scheduled a construction review call, sorted through courier documents. She handled it all, just as she always did, with poise and precision. But inside her, a small door had cracked open. At 6:12 p.m., she shut off her monitor. Most of the office had emptied hours earlier. She walked past Benjamin's office without looking in. The glow of his screen still illuminated his face, unreadable as always. As she stepped into the elevator alone, Clara adjusted her scarf and smoothed the crease in her sleeve. A voice echoed in her mind. "Dress like you belong." She didn't smile, but she didn't flinch either. Something was shifting, quietly, gradually, like the tide pulling away from the shore just before the wave rises. And deep down, Clara Hayes knew she might not be seen yet, but she wasn't invisible anymore. Sometimes the people with the quietest voices have the most to say. Before she was the woman with cardigans and neatly labeled folders. Clara Hayes was someone else, entirely. She once stood in front of a classroom, chalk dust on her hands, books stacked on her desk in uneven towers. High school English teacher fresh out of grad school, hopeful, maybe even a little fierce in her belief that stories could change people. Back then, her voice filled a room with warmth and questions. She quoted Emily Dickinson and Maya Angelou like scripture. Her eyes lit up when a student grasped metaphor for the first time. She wrote, too, late at night, long after the world quieted. Clara poured herself into pages, not just lesson plans or emails, but poetry, essays, stories that twisted gently around memory and longing. Her words were never loud, but they pulsed with life observant, tender, sometimes aching. Then came Evan. They met at a wedding. He was charming, a little reckless in the way confident men often are. He loved how smart she was. She loved how certain he seemed. It didn't take long before she said yes to his smile, yes to a shared apartment, yes to a life she thought would expand into something beautiful. But not all beginnings stay soft. Evan wanted more money, more status, more sparkle. Teaching, he said, wasn't enough. He wanted dinners with clients, weekends at the lake, someone who could match his pace. Clara tried, for a while. She stopped writing, put her dreams in a drawer, changed her clothes, her tone, her shape. But eventually, even that wasn't enough. He left on a Thursday. There was no screaming, just an envelope on the kitchen table, her name in looping cursive, and silence. A month later, her father was diagnosed. 4 months after that, he was gone. And so, Clara stopped dreaming. She moved back to Charleston to care for her mother, who had begun to forget why she entered rooms. The house smelled of lavender and loss. Clara took the first steady job she could find, front desk assistant, later promoted to executive secretary when the previous one moved to Florida. It wasn't teaching, it wasn't writing, but it paid the bills. And there was dignity in steadiness. Over time, Clara became a quiet pillar at Hawthorne and Wells. She learned the names of investors' spouses and remembered who liked cinnamon in their coffee. She built systems where chaos once lived, created spreadsheets no one else understood, color-coded filing that saved hours of time. When Benjamin flew to Phoenix last year and the hotel lost his reservation, it was Clara who found a nearby inn and booked it before he ever knew there'd been a problem. When a potential client mentioned their daughter's ballet recital in passing, Clara sent flowers 2 days later with a note that read, "Bravo. Lily." No one asked her to. No one thanked her either. But Clara had long stopped expecting recognition. She found purpose in being the quiet one who made sure everything kept running, the one who noticed things others missed. Like the intern crying in the break room after a presentation, or the way Mr. Hawthorne pinched the bridge of his nose when, overwhelmed, she'd started spacing out his meetings without telling him. She never asked for more. Except once. It was during the planning stages for the Low Country Literacy Project, a small initiative the company supported as part of its community outreach. The marketing team had asked for ideas. Clara, on a quiet evening after hours, had typed up a short proposal. Nothing elaborate, just a vision for how the company could support adult learners through partnerships with local libraries. She printed it on plain paper, left it in the ideas inbox without her name, and went home. 2 weeks later, Benjamin announced the new direction of the project. He praised its clarity, called it surprisingly thoughtful. He even joked rare for him that someone in the office had a future in writing policy. He never knew it was her. Clara didn't say a word. That night, she walked home in the crisp autumn air, coat wrapped tight, hands buried in her pockets. She smiled once, briefly. It wasn't pride. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was something gentler. The quiet ache of being heard, if only through a borrowed voice. Now, months later, that folder still sat in her drawer, labeled LLP draft. She'd never added to it, never dared. But lately, since that comment about her clothes, since the heat in her chest reminded her she was still alive, she'd been thinking about that folder again, and about her old notebooks, the ones with pressed flowers between the pages and ink smudges in the corners. On Wednesday afternoon, a light drizzle tapped gently on the office windows. Clara sat at her desk, eyes drifting from the monitor to the soft gray sky beyond. Across the street, a little girl in a red raincoat danced in a puddle while her mother held groceries. The child tilted her head to the sky and laughed, mouth open wide. Clara watched her, unmoving. Something behind her eyes shifted. A memory, a longing, a whisper. She wasn't sure, but the thought came, clear and soft as a feather landing. I used to have dreams. And for the first time in years, she didn't dismiss it. She let it sit beside her, quiet and welcome. One quiet suggestion changed how he saw her. Just a little. It happened during a Thursday morning meeting. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. Benjamin Hawthorne stood at the head of the long oak conference table, flipping through slides on the overhead screen. The room was full department heads, senior advisors, the legal team. Clara, as usual, sat near the corner, notepad in hand, blending into the wallpaper of authority and ambition. The project in question was a new downtown development, something sleek and modern, set to replace an aging block of historical homes. The numbers looked good. Investors were excited. Benjamin's presentation was, as always, crisp and confident, until Clara raised her hand. It wasn't high. It was a subtle lift, paired with her soft, steady voice. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she began, "but I believe the structure at 234 King Street is on the city's preservation list. It might cause a delay with permitting." The room stilled. Benjamin turned, brow faintly raised. Clara's gaze didn't falter. "I noticed it when I was cross-referencing addresses for the vendor contracts," she added, flipping to a tabbed page in her notebook. "It might be worth verifying before we finalize the proposal." There was a moment of silence, brief, but heavy. Then one of the attorneys nodded slowly. "She's right. I missed that." Benjamin said nothing at first. He simply looked at Clara for a second longer than usual, as if seeing her in slightly sharper focus. "Thank you," he said at last. His tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. After the meeting, Clara quietly slipped out, returning to her desk as if nothing had happened. She didn't bask in the correctness of her observation. She didn't wait for praise. But Benjamin, he noticed. For the rest of the day, his eyes followed her movements without meaning to. He noticed how her hands moved across the keyboard fast but fluid, precise, how she answered calls with calm clarity, never rushed, how she always carried a pen tucked behind her ear, even when not writing. He began to remember that she'd been with the company for over 5 years, that she rarely called out sick, that she always stayed late during deadline weeks. But for the first time, he wondered what else she did when the office lights dimmed, what books she read, if she still wrote in that small black notebook he once saw poking out of her tote bag. Clara wasn't loud, but there was something in her stillness, a steadiness he hadn't seen before or perhaps had chosen not to see. The next morning, he passed her desk and found his steps slowing. Her head was bent over a spreadsheet, brow gently furrowed. Her eyes flicked up for a moment. They met his, not long, but long enough. He nodded. She gave a small smile, polite, reserved, then returned to her work. The air between them shifted, barely, but it did. That afternoon, Benjamin stayed late. A board call had run longer than expected, and the last staffers had cleared out. The office was unusually quiet, shadows long across the floor. He made his way to the break room, intending to grab a bottled water. As he turned the corner, he paused. Inside, Clara sat alone at the small round table, her back to the door. Her shoulders were slumped, hands clasped tightly in front of her. A paper napkin lay on the table, slightly crumpled, and beside it, a coffee cup untouched. But what made him stop, what rooted him to the spot, was the sound, a small, broken breath, barely audible. Clara was crying, not loudly, not dramatically, the way people cry when they don't want to be heard, when they've held it in all day, all week, maybe longer. Benjamin had seen plenty of emotions in his life: anger, frustration, even tears sometimes, in high-stakes meetings or during layoffs. But this felt different. This felt personal. He didn't know what to do. His hand hovered near the doorframe. For a second, he considered turning around, pretending he hadn't seen her, giving her the privacy she clearly wanted, but instead he took one step forward and then stopped himself. No words came, no offers of comfort, no awkward questions, just silence. And in that moment, something in him softened. She wasn't just efficient, or quiet, or good at her job. She was human, and she was hurting. He stepped back quietly, careful not to startle her, walked away slowly, heart oddly heavy. That night, Benjamin sat at his desk long after everyone had left. He didn't open his laptop, didn't check his phone, He simply stared out the window at the quiet Charleston skyline. And for the first time in a very long time, a face came to mind that wasn't part of a contract or a deal. Clara Hayes. The woman he'd barely noticed for years. The woman whose quiet voice had changed the course of a project. The woman who, for reasons he couldn't yet name, had taken root in his thoughts. He didn't know why her tears stayed with him, but they did. He could still hear them soft, controlled, heartbreakingly polite. And somewhere deep in the corners of his mind, he began to wonder what else he'd missed while chasing everything he thought mattered. She planned the ball, handled every detail, yet never expected to be invited. Every corner of the office buzzed with anticipation. The winter gala was just 2 weeks away, and even the most reserved department heads were caught up in discussions of tuxedos, floor-length gowns, and who might be seated at whose table. It was Hawthorne and Wells' signature event, part celebration, part spectacle, part subtle battlefield of influence. The kind of night where careers turned on small conversations and lasting impressions were formed beneath golden chandeliers. Clara Hayes, however, had never been to the gala. She had organized it 5 years in a row, and every year she had stayed late the evening before to double-check the place cards, then slipped home alone. She didn't own a dress for such occasions. She had no date, no reason to be there, and more importantly, no one had ever asked her to come. This year was no different, at least. At first, she managed every moving part, confirming vendors, printing programs, coordinating with catering staff, adjusting last-minute RSVPs. Her spreadsheets had tabs for everything: dietary restrictions, VIP arrivals, press clearance. She kept the chaos from boiling over with quiet efficiency and 2 cups of black coffee before 9 a.m. Then, on a brisk Tuesday morning, something changed. A high-profile guest from New York, Eleanor Whitford, a donor whose foundation was funding a large museum restoration, called the executive office with a request. "I expect every member of the core project team to attend the gala," she said, her tone clipped but unmistakable. "That includes the woman handling our contracts and correspondence. She's been a godsend." Clara, sorting documents just outside Benjamin's office, froze. She heard the pause, a brief silence, as if Benjamin were weighing something, then his voice, calm and assured. "Of course, Ms. Hayes will be in attendance." The paper in Clara's hand trembled slightly. She slipped back to her desk before anyone noticed. That evening, after the last meeting had wrapped and the office had quieted into soft shadows, Clara returned to the mailroom to assemble the final batch of invitations. Thick envelopes in ivory cardstock, embossed in gold, sealed with wax. She double-checked the list, one by one. She added the labels: department heads, key partners, donors, senior advisors, and then one envelope sat alone at the edge of the table. Her name. She blinked, thinking maybe she was seeing things. But no, it was written in the same careful cursive as the others, her full name shining gently under the soft fluorescent light. Ms. Clara Hayes. You are cordially invited to the annual Hawthorne and Wells Winter Gala, Charleston Yacht Hall. Saturday, December 14th, 7:00 p.m. She picked it up with both hands, as if it might vanish. For a moment, she didn't breathe. She'd typed those words 100 times, formatted the layout, chosen the ink and the paperweight, but she had never imagined reading them addressed to her. Her eyes traced every curve of the lettering. The envelope was sealed like the others, as though her presence had always been part of the plan. She let out a quiet breath. And then, something unfamiliar tugged at her lips. A smile. Small. Soft. But real. Not the polite, practiced expression she wore at the front desk. Not the weary smile she offered her mother when the days felt long. This was different. This one belonged to her. She stared at the invitation a moment longer, then gently tucked it into her bag between her planner and her worn paperback novel. The walk home felt lighter somehow. She passed the cafe where she sometimes bought her Friday scone, the bookstore with the dog-eared copies in the window. Her boots clicked against the pavement in rhythm with the growing flutter in her chest. Later that night, as she stood in her small kitchen reheating soup, her phone vibrated against the countertop. She didn't have to look to know who it was. Sophie. Clara stared at the screen for a moment. Months ago, during one of their long calls, Sophie had said, "The day you're ready to be seen, truly seen, just call me. I'll make sure you shine." Clara had laughed it off then. Who would want to see me? But now something felt different. She picked up the phone, hit dial. The call connected almost instantly. Clara Sophie's voice was warm, always with that faint edge of excitement, like she was waiting for something beautiful to happen. Clara hesitated, then exhaled. "I think I'm ready," she said. There was a beat of silence on the other end, not awkward, just full of memories, of girlhood dreams, of promises made in quiet moments when the world felt too big. "Ready to be seen?" Sophie asked. Clara closed her eyes and whispered, "Yes, and across town." Sophie smiled. "Then get some sleep, sweetheart," she said, "because tomorrow we begin." The room turned quiet, and for once, he couldn't look away. Saturday evening arrived with a sky the color of faded sapphire and a wind that stirred the palmetto trees like a whisper of something about to change. Inside Sophie's apartment-turned-studio, Clara sat in front of a mirror she hadn't dared to look into in years. The lights were warm. The air smelled faintly of vanilla and hairspray. A soft vinyl record played in the background, one of those old jazz albums Sophie loved, full of saxophones and honeyed silence between the notes. Clara's heart beat a little faster. Sophie worked with reverent hands, not covering anything, not erasing, but unveiling. The makeup wasn't heavy, just enough to let her cheekbones speak, to bring out the green in her eyes and the soft rose in her lips. Her hair had been freed from its usual tight bun, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, the kind of waves that moved when she did. Sophie had added subtle highlights, a golden hue that shimmered like candlelight when it caught the strands. And then there was the dress, midnight blue, elegant, quiet. The kind of dress you didn't wear to be noticed, but to be remembered. It hugged her gently, as if tailored for no one else. The neckline was simple, modest, the sleeves sheer and graceful. Silver earrings dangled just beneath her jaw, catching the light when she turned her head. Sophie stepped back, folded her arms, and just looked at her. "You were always this beautiful," she whispered. "Tonight, you just let the world see it." Clara stood, smoothing the fabric across her waist. She caught her reflection again, saw the calmness in her own eyes. The woman she used to dream of becoming when she was younger, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like herself. The Charleston Yacht Hall glowed with golden light. Strings of soft bulbs lined the entrance, and inside, everything shimmered mirrored floors, linen-draped tables, candlelight flickering like memory. Benjamin Hawthorne stood near the center of it all, speaking with two key investors near the champagne fountain. His tuxedo was tailored perfectly, his cufflinks silver and understated, but something in his expression was distracted, unsettled. He'd been like that all evening. Ever since he arrived, he'd felt a strange sense of anticipation he couldn't quite explain, as if he were waiting for something or someone he couldn't name. Then it happened. A pause, a hush, just near the main entrance, as a few heads turned first, politely, then with surprise. She entered without fanfare, no entourage, no dramatic gesture, just a woman in a blue dress, her posture calm, her steps deliberate, her gaze quietly scanning the room. She didn't try to command attention, but it came to her anyway. The lights above caught her hair like they had been waiting all evening just to land there. Her smile, soft, restrained, held something older than beauty. It held depth. Benjamin saw her and stopped mid-sentence. His drink stilled in his hand. His mind reached, scrambled. Something familiar, yet completely foreign. Who was she? A Model A visiting donor's daughter? No. There was something behind her eyes that made his breath catch, and then she turned just enough. He saw it, and everything inside him went still. Clara Hayes. It hit him like stepping off a curb you didn't see coming. His mind reeled, flipping through memories like a Rolodex in fast motion. The quiet woman at the front desk, the steady hands, the soft voice, the eyes he had only glanced at in passing. He hadn't noticed how green they were, or how they narrowed slightly when she was focused, or how, when she smiled, like now they held a quiet kind of strength that made the noise around him fade. This couldn't be her, and yet it was, not transformed, not replaced, just revealed. Benjamin felt his heart stammer in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in decades, not since he was a young man sitting in the back of a law class, watching a woman laugh over a textbook joke. He took a step forward, as if drawn, but she saw him first, and in the space between their eyes, meeting, something passed, not surprise, not awkwardness, clarity. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She held his gaze steady, calm, knowing. Then she smiled, not for him, but for herself, and just as effortlessly as she had arrived, she turned, stepping deeper into the room, graceful, collected. She passed by a group of architects, spoke briefly with a foundation director, took a glass of sparkling water from a server with a gentle nod. Benjamin watched her move, and for the first time in his adult life, he felt completely still, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because he realized how much of her he had never seen, how much of her he had never cared to see. And now that he did, he wasn't sure how to undo 3 years of blind indifference. The music swelled. Conversations resumed. But Benjamin Hawthorne stood there, in the middle of the gilded ballroom, surrounded by wealth and charm and influence, feeling, for the first time in years, like he'd been left behind. After years of silence, it was the things not said that rang the loudest. The gala had come and gone, but something lingered in its wake like the scent of perfume on a scarf or a half-remembered song that played in your head days later. Benjamin couldn't stop thinking about her. Not just the way she looked that night, though the image of Clara in midnight blue was burned into his memory, but the way she carried herself, the quiet certainty in her steps, the stillness in her eyes, as if she'd spent a long time being overlooked and now chose exactly when and how to be seen. He found himself watching the office differently now. There she was, sitting at her desk as she always had. But now, he noticed the way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear when concentrating, the way her fingers moved across the keyboard quick, efficient, purposeful, the way she paused, just briefly, before answering the phone, centering herself. He started to speak to her more often, not out of obligation, not to assign tasks, but because he wanted to. Small things, at first. Asking her thoughts on a proposal draft, noticing when she switched her coffee order, pausing to ask if she needed anything when the afternoon meetings ran long, Clara answered with polite professionalism, her tone as calm as ever. But there was a difference, subtle but sure. She no longer looked away when he spoke to her. She met his gaze, unflinching, steady. Yet she held a kind of distance, a quiet boundary, not drawn in anger but in dignity. She wasn't trying to punish him. She was simply protecting herself. And somehow, that made him respect her even more. The hardest part, Benjamin realized, was that he couldn't fix what he hadn't seen. He couldn't erase 3 years of walking past her desk without a glance. But perhaps he could start building something new, brick by brick. One afternoon, when the rain came down in soft streaks against the windows, he knocked gently on the doorframe to the small office Clara sometimes used to store files. She looked up, surprised. "I just had a quick question about the Davis contract," he said. She nodded, motioning him inside. He stepped in, and his eyes fell on a stack of documents on the side table, marketing drafts, brochures, and beneath them, a faded manila folder, worn at the edges. Curious. He reached for it, then paused. "May I?" Clara hesitated, then nodded, just once. He opened it. Inside was a short manuscript typed, single-spaced, bound by a thin black clip. The title page read, "When the World Forgot to Look," by Clara Hayes. His breath caught. The first paragraph was gentle, poetic. It spoke of growing up in a town where the trees remembered your name, but the people rarely did. About becoming a woman in the quiet shadows of others, learning to listen, to observe. He didn't mean to read further, but the words pulled him in. Clara's voice on the page was rich and luminous, honest, unapologetically tender. She wrote of loss, of resilience, of the way some women learn to shrink so small that they no longer cast shadows, and what it takes to finally step into the light again. He stood there, silent, turning page after page. Behind him, Clara said nothing. He could feel her watching him, cautious, curious, waiting. When he looked up, his eyes met hers with something different this time. Not guilt, not apology, but recognition. "You wrote this," he said softly, though he knew she had. She gave a small nod. "It's beautiful," he added, his voice uneven. Clara looked down, a faint smile touching the corner of her mouth. "It's just something I used to work on. I never finished it." He closed the folder with reverent care, as if it were something sacred. "You should finish it. I mean." She gave a quiet, thoughtful shrug. "Maybe." Benjamin held the folder a moment longer, then handed it back. "I see you now," he said gently. Clara looked up sharply, but not unkindly. There was silence between them. Not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that allows something else to breathe. Something fragile and unspoken. Then Clara stood and took the folder from his hands. "Thank you," she said softly. Not just for the compliment, but for something more. Benjamin didn't follow her as she left the room. He didn't try to say more. He simply stood there, surrounded by the sound of rain tapping softly against the glass, and realized, for the first time, he was beginning to see her not as a secretary, not as a woman in a blue dress, but as herself. And that terrified him more than he cared to admit. He had everything except the courage to ask for what he truly wanted. Benjamin Hawthorne was a man of many decisions. In courtrooms, boardrooms, and investment meetings, he was known for swift, surgical judgment, never one to hesitate when the numbers made sense. But nothing in Clara's manuscript made sense. Not to a businessman, at least. And yet, he couldn't stop thinking about it. He read it again one evening in his study, long after the city lights of Charleston had dimmed to a soft hum through the bay windows. Her words weren't polished like a best-selling novelist's, but they had something rarer truth, raw and vivid, the kind of truth that made a man sit still and listen. He thought about all the people who had ever felt small, unseen, forgotten, and then he thought about her. He picked up the phone. An old friend of his from college, Peter Langford, now ran an independent publishing imprint in Atlanta, mostly memoirs and literary nonfiction. Peter owed him a favor. 2 days later, a package arrived at the imprint with no cover letter, no grand pitch, just a title page. When the World Forgot to Look by Clara Hayes. It was a gamble, and Benjamin had made many, but never one like this. That same morning, Clara found a note tucked inside her desk drawer. Cream-colored cardstock, his handwriting precise, slanted slightly to the right. You once said you'd never finish it. I hope you do. I think the world needs to hear you write, that's all. B. She read the words twice, then once more, slower. Her throat tightened. It wasn't a love letter. It didn't try to fix anything. It was just him seeing her. Her, not the secretary, not the woman in the blue dress. And that made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. She closed her eyes and let the moment settle. Then, she folded the note carefully and placed it in her purse, where it stayed right beside her house keys and a photo of her mother from years ago. By Friday, the air in the office had changed. Spring was gently arriving, longer daylight, a breeze that smelled like rain and jasmine. Clara arrived earlier than usual, dressed simply, as always, hair pulled back, lips bare. But something in her eyes was different. Resolved. She walked to Benjamin's office with a sealed envelope in her hand. He looked up when she knocked. "Got a minute?" she asked. He gestured for her to come in, setting down the file he'd been reviewing. She placed the envelope on his desk. My resignation. The words landed softly, but their meaning rang out like a bell. He didn't answer right away. I'm not leaving out of anger, she added, her voice steady. I just need to see who I am outside of this building. Benjamin reached for the envelope but didn't open it. He looked at her, really looked. She didn't flinch, didn't waver. I'm proud of what I've done here, she continued, but if I stay, I'll shrink again. And I've just started remembering how not to. There was no malice in her words, only clarity. Benjamin nodded slowly. Where will you go? Clara gave a small smile. Maybe back to the classroom. Maybe finish that book. I'm not sure yet. But for once, I'm okay with not knowing. He wanted to say so many things, that her leaving would leave a hollow in the rhythm of his days, that he would miss her laugh, the quiet one she only let slip when she thought no one heard, that the office would feel colder without her presence, that he would. But he didn't say any of it, because this moment was about her, and keeping her here, even with the best of intentions, would only dim the light she'd fought so hard to reclaim. So instead, he stood and held out his hand. Thank you, he said softly. She took it. Their hands met brief, warm, unspoken, and then released. Later that evening, as she packed up her few things, a coffee mug, a notebook, a photo of her and her mother from the holidays, she paused by the window. The city lights were beginning to flicker on, the same view she'd seen every day for 3 years, now felt new. There was freedom in her chest, not because she was running away, but because she was walking toward something that had been waiting for her, just outside the frame. Some hearts need to be alone to grow strong enough to love again. The new apartment was modest, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, with scuffed wooden floors that creaked just enough to feel like history. The windows let in a good kind of light, the kind that changed throughout the day, like the shifting chapters of a book. Clara painted the kitchen walls a soft sage green. She bought herself a kettle with flowers printed on it. She found joy in small things, fresh bread from the bakery down the street, a neighbor who always watered her plants when she forgot, and the sound of pages turning at night while the city fell asleep outside her window. She didn't miss the view from the 21st floor. She didn't miss being invisible. Each morning, she walked 2 blocks to the Charleston Public Library, a grand old building with stone lions guarding the entrance and sunlit reading rooms that smelled like worn pages and old stories. She had accepted a part-time role teaching a weekly writing class, Memoirs and Meaning Writing, The Life You've Lived. At first, it was just 5 people, retirees, single parents, a shy teenage girl with poems hidden in her hoodie sleeve. Clara sat with them, not above them. She spoke less like a teacher and more like a woman who had learned, finally, to listen to herself. Her words no longer trembled. They carried. 6 months passed. And then, one morning in early autumn, a small brown box appeared on her doorstep. She knew what it was the moment she saw the return label, Langford Press. Inside, nestled in cream-colored paper, was her book, When the World Forgot to Look, by Clara Hayes. The cover was simple, a watercolor sketch of a woman walking alone on a winding path, trees arching overhead like watchful witnesses. She held it in her hands for a long time before opening the first page. To her surprise, there was a note inside, from Peter Langford. Your manuscript came without fanfare, but it didn't need any. The quiet ones often carry the loudest truth. Thank you for reminding me what good writing sounds like. Clara sat down slowly at her kitchen table. Tears blurred the words on the page, but not the meaning. Her story had found its place in the world. Within weeks, the book spread by word of mouth. A local paper ran a feature on her. Then a regional radio show asked her to speak about the writing process. Book clubs picked it up. Some readers mailed her handwritten letters, thanking her for giving voice to what they'd felt their whole lives, but never had the words to say. Clara didn't seek fame. She only wanted to matter. Now, for the first time, she knew she did. She smiled more, laughed louder, walked taller. The woman who once shrank from her own reflection now stopped to fix her lipstick in cafe windows. She wore earrings again, read poetry at open mic nights, let herself be seen, and through it all, there was one thing she hadn't done. She hadn't written him back. Benjamin's email had come on a quiet Sunday evening. The subject line was simple. Checking in, inside. Just a few lines. I don't want to intrude. Just wanted to say, I read your book. Twice. You wrote the truth. Clara, and I hope, wherever you are, you're finally being seen for everything you are. I still see you. B. She had read it 4 times that night, and again the next morning. The words were gentle, unobtrusive. They didn't ask for anything. They just were. But she hadn't replied, not because she was angry, not because she didn't feel something, but because her heart was still healing, still learning to beat for herself before it could beat beside someone else's, still learning the sound of her own voice. Some days, she almost typed a response, but she always stopped at the same place just after writing his name. That evening, she lit a candle by the window, she opened her laptop, and before pulling up lesson plans for the next week, she opened Benjamin's email once more and read the final line out loud. Just to herself, I still see you. She closed her eyes and let herself believe it. Some endings are just new beginnings, dressed in silence. The line for the book signing stretched past the front steps of the Charleston Public Library. The spring air was soft that day, with the scent of magnolias drifting in through open doors. Inside. Clara Hayes sat behind a modest table, her name printed in a simple serif font on a folded card. She smiled at each person who approached, sometimes warm and steady, sometimes a little shy, like she couldn't quite believe this was her life now. Most came with books already worn at the corners, dog-eared and underlined. Some brought letters, a few brought tears. She greeted them all with grace. She had done interviews, podcasts, even a local TV segment. But this moment, sitting in her own town, among people who saw her not as someone small or ordinary, but as someone whose words mattered, that was the most real of all. The line was steady, familiar faces, strangers who felt familiar. And then, he appeared. No announcement, no fanfare. Benjamin Hawthorne stood quietly near the back of the line, holding a copy of her book like it might slip through his fingers. He wore no tie, just a charcoal sport coat over a pale blue shirt. There were new lines around his eyes, less from age, more from something else, something softer. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat, everything else fell away. She looked at him without surprise, without bitterness, just presence. By the time he reached her table, Clara's pen hovered midair. He didn't speak right away, neither did she. Instead, he placed a folder gently on the table beside her book. Cream-colored, tied with a ribbon, something old-fashioned about it. "This isn't a manuscript," he said, his voice quiet but sure. "It's a proposal, a joint one." Clara raised an eyebrow, amused despite herself. Benjamin's smile was small, unsure. "It's a publishing imprint, focused on voices like yours, real ones, ones that get overlooked." She blinked. "And why bring this to me? Because you once helped me build something that mattered to me," he said, his tone steady. "Now I want to help you build something that matters to you." He paused, then slid the folder an inch closer. "You once helped me build my empire. Let me help you build your dreams." The words hung in the air between them, simple, without pressure. An offering, not a plea. Clara opened the folder slowly. Inside was a draft, a small publishing imprint proposal, complete with mission statement, financial backing, and a list of writers he had already begun to scout, most of them women, older adults, and first-time authors. Her kind of people, her kind of stories. She ran her fingers over the paper, letting the moment settle deep in her bones. He didn't interrupt. He just stood there, like he had all the time in the world. "You never did tell me what changed," she said finally, not looking up. "What do you mean? The man who once told me to dress more appropriately now wants to build a company that amplifies unheard voices." He smiled, a little ruefully. "I think it started when you took off your glasses," he said, "and then finished when you walked away." She chuckled. "That's a lot of growth for one man." He shrugged, almost sheepishly. "Turns out, losing someone you didn't realize you needed does that to you." They both fell quiet, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was full of something else, a kind of peace. The line behind him was still moving, politely quiet. One or two people held out phones to take a picture of Clara, but she barely noticed. Her eyes remained on him. "You know I'm not the same woman I was," she said gently. "I know," Benjamin replied, "and that's the point." She looked down at the folder again. The paper was warm beneath her palm. So much had changed, but one thing hadn't. The way her heart still softened at the sight of his eyes. Not because she needed him, but because now finally she could choose him. Freely. Clearly. not from a place of loneliness, but from fullness. She closed the folder carefully, then looked up and nodded. Not with grand emotion, not with a rush of music or gasping breath, just a simple, quiet nod, like the turning of a page. Benjamin let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, and in that small, wordless moment, they began again. She never needed to change. He just needed to learn how to see. It had been exactly 1 year since Clara Hayes stood behind a folding table at the Charleston Public Library, signing copies of her first book with fingers that trembled ever so slightly. Now, she stood beneath a cascade of warm lights on the stage of the Riverton Theater, a historic building once forgotten, now brimming with women who had rediscovered their voices. The crowd was hushed as she adjusted the microphone. Her long navy dress swept just past her ankles, and a single silver pin held her hair back from her face. She looked steady, certain, as though she had grown into herself entirely. Benjamin stood just a few feet behind her, his hands folded loosely, watching her with a quiet kind of reverence. They were co-hosting the inaugural gala for the Hayes Fund, a non-profit dedicated to supporting women writers over 40 who had never been published. It had been Clara's idea. Benjamin had simply followed her lead. Not as a boss, not even as a partner, in the traditional sense, but as someone who believed in her light and wanted to help her make it reach farther than either of them had imagined. As Clara spoke to the room, her words gentle, her voice calm, there was no trace of the woman who once sat behind a silent desk in carefully buttoned cardigans. Instead, there was a woman who had rebuilt her life from the quiet places. I used to think I had nothing to say, she shared, that the stories inside me were too small, too soft to matter. But I've learned that sometimes the softest stories are the ones that stay. She looked toward Benjamin briefly. And sometimes, all we need is for someone to say, "I see you." The audience held its breath, then, rising slowly to applause. Benjamin stepped forward. He didn't take the mic right away. Instead, he looked out into the crowd, a sea of women in every stage of becoming, some dressed boldly, some modestly, some nervous, some proud. Then he looked at Clara, only her, and began to speak. "I used to measure success in square footage and boardroom charts," Benjamin began, his voice deeper than usual, but unshaken. "I ran a company, built towers, wore suits that cost more than the monthly rent of most of my employees." A soft murmur of amusement stirred in the room. He let it settle. "But none of that ever taught me what this woman taught me without even trying to." He paused, emotion catching in his throat for just a moment. "I once mocked the person who would go on to teach me what it means to truly see." A hush. Clara didn't move. I didn't see her when she brought me coffee, or when she corrected a spreadsheet that would have cost us a deal. I didn't see her when she stayed late for weeks without being asked, or when she held her mother's hand through treatment and still showed up to work the next morning. Benjamin turned toward her, then completely. I didn't see her when she was invisible, but she's the reason I now see everyone a little clearer. The room exhaled as one, not with cheers, but with quiet tears. After the event, people lingered. Donors approached Clara with ideas. Women hugged her with trembling hands. One brought a wrinkled poem she'd written at 58 and asked if Clara would read it. She promised she would, and meant it. Later that evening, long after the crowd had left, Benjamin and Clara stepped out into the night air of Charleston. The scent of the sea hung faintly in the breeze. Street lights flickered, and the cobblestone below their feet glowed faintly in the soft amber light. They walked in silence for a while, not the awkward kind, but the kind shared by people who have nothing left to prove and everything left to share. Clara's heels clicked softly beside him. She no longer hunched, no longer looked down when he spoke. She never had to. "I was thinking," he said, slipping his hand gently into hers. "We should run next year's event in Savannah. New voices, new stories." She smiled. "Only if we include a panel on women over 60. They're always the most overlooked." "I wouldn't dream of forgetting them." He squeezed her hand. She didn't ask where they were headed. Neither did he. Because the destination didn't matter anymore. They'd already arrived. Not at a place, but at a way of being. They turned the corner near the Battery, where the harbor opened up like a quiet painting. The sky had turned a warm lavender, the final rays of sunset brushing gold across the rooftops. Clara stopped and looked out. Benjamin stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder. Neither spoke. But in the stillness, something passed between them, something weightless and complete. Not the promise of forever, but the promise of presence, to walk beside each other, to see and be seen as they were, no longer as boss and secretary, but as partners, in story, in purpose, in life. Sometimes the most powerful kind of strength is quiet. It's not loud or demanding. It's the kind that shows up every day, even when no one notices. Clara Hayes taught us that being unseen does not mean being unworthy, that dignity, kindness, and resilience have their own quiet power. In a world that often values appearances over substance, her story is a gentle reminder. True worth isn't found in how others see us, but in how we choose to see ourselves. We all go through seasons where we feel invisible, whether it's after a loss, a career change, or simply growing older in a world that chases youth. But Clara's journey reminds us that transformation isn't about becoming someone new, it's about allowing the world to finally see the truth we've always carried inside. And perhaps, more importantly, it reminds us to see others, truly see them. Because a kind word, a moment of recognition, or simply paying attention might just change someone's life. So today, pause a little longer, speak a little softer, look a little deeper. You never know what beauty is waiting just behind the silence. Thank you for spending your time with us today. If Clara's story touched your heart, we invite you to like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to our channel for more soul-stirring stories. Your support means the world to us and helps these quiet voices be heard. Until next time, take gentle care.